Hello, my darlings. Mother Raven here, and on this lovely Thanksgiving Day, I am going to share on also Folklore Thursday. I am going to share some more animal ghost stories to go with the theme. Again, out of Animal Ghosts by Eliot O'Donnell. Chapter 1. Cats. In opening this volume on animals and their associations with the unknown, I will commence with a case of hauntings in the old manor house at Oxenby. My informant was a Mrs. Hartnell, whom I can see in my mind's eye as distinctly as if I was looking at her now. Hers was a personality that no lapse of time, nothing could efface. A personality that made itself felt on boys of all temperaments, most of all, of course, on those who, like myself, were highly strung and sensitive. She was a classical mistress at L's, the then well-known dame school in Clifton, where for 3 years prior to migrating to a public school, I was well grounded in all the mysticism of Kennedy's Latin primer and Smith's First Greek Principia. I doubt if she got anything more than a very small salary. Governesses in those days were shockingly remunerate, and I know, poor soul, she had to work monstrously hard. Drumming Latin and Greek into heads as thick as ours was no easy task. There were times when the excessive tension on the nerves proved too much. Mrs. Hartnell stole a little relaxation when she allowed herself to chat with us and even to smile. Heavens, those smiles! And when I can feel the tingling of my pulse at the bare mention of it, she spoke about herself, stated she had once been young, a declaration so astounding, so utterly beyond our comprehension, that we were rendered quite speechless, and told us anecdotes. Many of her narratives I have no recollection, but one or two, which interested me more than the rest, are almost as fresh in my mind as when recounted. The one that appealed to me most, and which I have every reason to believe is absolutely true, is as follows. I give it as nearly as I can in my own somewhat stilted style. Up to the age of 19, I resided with my parents in the manor house, Oxenby. It was an old building dating back, I believe, to the reign of Edward VI, and had originally served as the residence of noble families. Built, or rather faced with split flints, and edged and buttressed with cut gray stone, it had a majestic, though rather gloomy appearance, and seen from afar, resembled nothing so much as a huge, grotesque, decorated sarcophagus. In the center of its frowning and menacing front was a device of a cat, constructed out of black shingles, and having white shingles for eyes, the effect being curiously realistic, especially on moonlit nights, when anything more lifelike and sinister could scarcely have been conceived. The artist, whomever he was, had more than human knowledge of cats. He betrayed not merely their bodies, but their souls. I have subsequently met several people who experienced the same phenomena in the house, which was standing a short time ago. In style, the front of the house was somewhat castigated. 2 semicircular bows, or half-towers, placed at a suitable distance from each other, rose from the base to the summit of the edifice, to the height of 4 or 5 stairs, and were pierced at every floor with rows of stone-mullioned windows. The flat wall between had larger windows, lighting the great hall, gallery, and upper apartments. These windows were wholly composed of stained glass, engraved with every imaginable fantastic design. Imps, satyrs, dragons, witches, queer-shaped trees, hands, eyes, circles, triangles, and cats. The towers, half included in the building, were completely circular within and contained the winding stairs of the mansion, and whomever ascended them when a storm was raging seemed rising by a whirlwind to the clouds. In the upper rooms, even the wildest screams of the hurricane were drowned in the rattling clamor of the assaulted casements. When a gale of wind took the building in front, it rocked it to its foundations and, at such times, threatened its instant demolition. Midway between the towers there stood forth a heavy stone porch with a Gothic gateway, surmounted by the battlement parapets made gable fashion, the apex of which was garnished by a pair of dolphins, rampant and antagonistic, whose corkscrew tails seemed contorted, especially at night, by the last agonies of rage convulsed. The porch doors stood open, except in tremendous weather. The inner ones were regularly shut and barred after all who entered. They led into a wide, vaulted, and lofty hall, the halls of which were decorated with faded tapestry that rose and fell and rustled in the most mysterious fashion every time there was a suspicion, and often barely the suspicion of a breeze. Interspersed with the tapestry, and in great contrast to its antiquity, were quite modern and very ordinary portraits of my family. The general fittings and furniture, both of the hall and house, were somber and handsome. Truss beams, corbels, girders, and panels were of the blackest oak, and the general effect of all this, augmented, if anything, by the windows, which were too high and narrow to admit much light, was much the same as that produced by the interior of a subterranean chapel or charnel house. From the hall proceeded doorways and passageways more than my memory can now particularize. Of these portables, one at each end conducted to the tower stairs, other to reception rooms and domestic offices. The whole of the house being too large for us, only one wing, the right and newer of the two, was occupied. The other was unfurnished and generally shut up. I say generally because there were times when either my mother or father, the servants never ventured there, forgot to lock the doors, and the handles yielding to my daring fingers, I surreptitiously crept in. Everywhere, even in daylight, even on the sunniest of mornings, were dark shadows that hung around the ingles and recesses of the rooms, the deep cupboards, the passages, the silent, winding staircases. There was one corridor, long, low, vaulted, where the shadows assembled in particular. I can see them now as I saw them then, as they have come to me many times in my dreams, grouped about the doorways, flitting to and fro on the bare, dismal boards, and congregated in menacing clusters at the head of the sepulchral staircase leading to the cellars. Generally, and excepting at times, when the weather was particularly violent, the silence here was so empathetic that I could never feel it was altogether natural, but rather that it was assumed especially for my benefit to intimidate me. If I moved, if I coughed, almost if I breathed, the whole passage was filled with the hoarse, reverberating echoes that in my affrighted ears appeared to terminate in a series of mirthless, malevolent chuckles. Once, when fascinated beyond control, I stole on tiptoes along the passage, momentarily expecting a door to fly open and something grim and horrible to pounce out on me. I was brought to a standstill by a loud, clanging noise, as if a pail or some such utensil, was being set down very roughly on a stone floor. Then there was the sound of rushing footsteps and of someone hastily ascending the cellar staircase, in fearful anticipation as to what I should see, for there was something in the sounds that told me that they were not made by anything human. I stood in the middle of the passage and stared. Up, up, up they came, until I saw the dark, indefinite shape of something very horrid, but which I could not, I dare not, define. It was accompanied by the clanging of a pail. I tried to scream, but my tongue cleaving to the roof of my mouth prevented my uttering a syllable, and when I essayed to move, I found I was temporarily paralyzed. The thing came rushing down on me. I grew icy cold all over, and when it was within a few feet of me, my horror was so great, I fainted. On recovering consciousness, it was some minutes before I summoned up my courage to open my eyes, but when I did so, they alighted on nothing but the empty passage. The thing had disappeared. On another occasion, when I was clandestinely paying a visit to the unused wing, and was in the act of mounting one of the staircases leading from the corridor I have just described to the first floor, there was the sound of a furious scuffle overhead, and something dashed down the stairs past me. I instinctively looked up, and there, glaring down at me from the balustrade, was a very white face. It was that of a man, but very badly proportioned, the forehead being low and receding, and the rest of the face too long and narrow. The crown rose to a kind of peak, the ears were pointed and sat very low down and far back. The mouth was very cruel and thin-lipped. The teeth were yellow and uneven. There was no hair on the face, but that on the head was red and matted. The eyes were obliquely set, pale blue, and full of an expression so absolutely malignant that every atom of my blood in my veins seemed to congeal as I met their gaze. I could not clearly see the body of the thing. It was hazy and indistinct, but the impression I got of it was that it was clad in some sort of tight-fitting, fantastic garment. As the landing was in semi-darkness, and the face, at all events, was most startlingly visible, I concluded it brought with it a light of its own, though there was none of that lurid glow attached to it which I subsequently learned is almost inseparable from spirit phenomena seen under similar conditions. For some seconds I was too overcome with terror to move, but my faculties at length reasserted themselves. I turned around and flew to the other wing of the house with the utmost precipitation. One would have thought that after these experiences, none would have included me to run the risk of such another encounter. Yet only a few days after the incident of the head, I was again impelled by a fascination I could not withstand to visit the same quarters. In sickly anticipation of what my eyes would alight on, I stole to the foot of the staircase and peeped cautiously up. To my infinite joy, there was nothing there but a bright patch of sunshine that, in the most unusual fashion, had forced its way through from one of the slits of the window near at hand. After gazing at it long enough to assure myself it was only sunshine, I quitted the spot and proceeded on my way down the vaulted corridor. Just as I was passing one of the doors, it opened. I stopped, terrified. What could it be? Bit by bit, inch by inch, I watched the gap slowly widen. At last, just as I felt I must either go mad or die, something appeared, and, to my utter astonishment, it was a big, black cat! Limping painfully, it came towards me with a curious, gliding motion, and I perceived with a thrill of horror that it had been very cruelly maltreated. One of its eyes looked as if it had been gouged out. Its ears were lacerated, whilst the paw of one of its hind legs had either been torn or hacked off. As I drew back from it, it made a feeble and pathetic effort to reach me and rub itself against my legs, as is the way with cats. But in doing so, it fell down and uttered a half purr, half gurgle, vanished. It seemed to sink through the hard oak boards. That evening, my youngest brother met with an accident in the barn at the back of the house and died. Though I did not then associate his death with the apparition of the cat, the latter shocked me so much, for I was extremely fond of animals. I did not dare venture into the wing again for nearly 2 years. When next I did so, it was early one June morning, between 5 and 6, and none of the family, save my father, who was out in the fields looking after his men, were as yet up. I explored the dreaded corridor and staircases, which was crossing the floor of one of the rooms I had hitherto regarded as immune from ghostly influences, when there was an icy rush of wind. The door behind me slammed to violently, and a heavy object struck me with great force in the hollow of my back. With a cry of surprise and agony, I turned sharply around, and there, lying on the floor, stretched out in the last convulsions of death, was the big black cat, maimed and bleeding as it had been on the previous occasion. How I got out of the room I do not recall. I was too horror-stricken to know exactly what I was doing, but I distinctly remember that as I tugged the door open, there was a low, gleeful chuckle, and something slipped by me and disappeared in the direction of the corridor. At noon that day, my mother had a seizure of apoplexy and died at midnight. Again, there was a lapse of years, this time nearly 4, when, sent on an errand from my father, I turned the key of one of the doors leading to the empty wing, and once again found myself within its haunted precincts. All was just as it had been on the occasion of my last visit. Gloom, stillness, and cobwebs reigned everywhere, whilst permeating the atmosphere was a feeling of intense sadness and depression. I did what was required of me as quickly as possible, and was crossing one of the rooms to make my exit, when a dark shadow fell outward the threshold of the door, and I saw the cat. That evening, my father dropped dead as he was hastening home through the fields. He had long suffered from heart disease. After his death, that is to say, my brother, sisters, and self were obliged to leave the house and go out into the world to earn our living. We never went there again, and never heard of any of the subsequent tenants experience similar manifestations. This is as near as I can recall Mrs. Hartnell's story, but as it is a good many years since I heard it, there is just a possibility of some of the details, the smaller ones at any event, having escaped my memory. When I was grown up, I stayed for a few weeks near Oxenby and met at a garden party a Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler, the then occupants of the manor house. I asked if they believed in ghosts, and told them I had always heard their house was haunted. Well, they said, we never believed in ghosts till we came to Oxenby, but we have seen and heard such strange things since we have been in the manor house, that we are now prepared to believe anything. They went on to tell me that they and many of the visitors and servants had seen the phantasms of a very hideous and maligned old man, clad in tight-fitting hosiery of medieval days, and a maimed and bleeding big black cat that seemed sometimes to drop from the ceiling and sometimes to be thrown at them. In one of the passages, all sorts of queer sounds, such as whinings, meanings, screechings, and clangings of pails and rattling of chains were heard, while something no one could ever quite distinctly, but which they all felt to be indescribably nasty, rushed up the cellar stairs and flew past, as if engaged in a desperate chase. Indeed, the disturbances were of so constant and harrowing a nature that the wing had to be vacated and was eventually locked up. The Wheelers excavated in different parts of the haunted wing and found, in the cellar, at a depth of some 8 or 9 feet, the skeletons of 3 men and 2 women, whilst in the wainscoting of the passage they discovered the bones of a boy, all of which remains they had properly interned at the churchyard. According to local tradition handed down through many centuries by word of mouth, the house originally belonged to a knight who, with his wife, was killed out hunting. He had only one child, a boy of about 10, who became a ward in Chancery. The man appointed by the Crown as guardian to this child proved an inhuman monster, and, after ill-treating the lad in every conceivable manner, eventually murdered him and tried to substitute a bastard boy of his own in his place. For a time the fraud succeeded, but on being eventually found out, the murderer and his offspring were both brought to trial and hanged. During his occupation of the house, many people were seen to enter the premises, but never leave them. The place got the most sinister reputation. Among other deeds credited to the murderer and his offspring was the mutilation and boiling of a cat, the particular pet of the young heir, who was compelled to witness the whole revolting process. Years later, a subsequent owner of the property had a monument erected in the churchyard to the memory of this poor abused child, and on the front of the house constructed the device of the cat. Though it is impossible to determine what amount of truth there may be in this tradition, it certainly seems to accord with the hauntings and to supply some sort of explanation to them. The ghostly head on the banister might well be that of the low and brutal guardian, whose spirit would be the exact counterpart of his mind. The figure seen and the noises heard in the passage point to the reenactment of some tragedy, possibly the murder of the heir or the slaughter of his cat, in either of which a bucket might easily have played a grim, significant part. And if human murderers and their victims have phantasms, why should not animals have phantasms too? Why should not the phenomenon of the cat seen by Mrs. Hartnell and the Wheelers have been the actual phantasm of an earthbound cat? No amount of reasoning, religious or otherwise, has yet annihilated the possibility of all forms of earthly life possessing spirits. A letter from my wife. I heard the foregoing account from my husband when I first met him years ago, and I know it to be true. I have seen the rooms, etc., in the old manor house, Oxenby, where the incidents Mrs. Hartnell mentioned took place. Ada B. O'Donnell. To further substantiate my views, and with regard to future existence for animals, I reproduce, by permission of the editor, the following letters and articles that have appeared from time to time in the Occult Review. July 2nd, 1913. Letter 1. That Other Cat. One evening, about 4 years ago, I was in my drawing room with 2 friends. We were all standing up to the point of going to bed, and only waiting until the old cook had succeeded in inducing the gray Persian cat to come in for the night. This was something difficult, and the cook came up, as on this occasion, and called him from the balcony, and the French window was wide open, when a cat rushed in at the window and through the door. "What was that?" we said, looking at one another. It was not Kitty, the gray Persian, but darker. And was it really a cat, or what? My friend Rugen has written the account of what she saw before seeing what I have said. Iona confirmed our description. What I saw seemed dark and shadowy, and yet unmistakably a cat. It seemed to me like the predecessor of Kitty, which was a black Persian. He had the same habit of coming in at night by this window, and he constantly rushed through the room and downstairs, being in a hurry for his supper. A moment or two afterwards, the gray cat walked slowly in, and though we searched the house, we could not find no other. Thanet. Letter 2, Fräulein Mullet's story. 3 or 4 years ago, Iona and I were sitting in the drawing room on a Sunday evening when Cook came in and asked for Kitty, a silver-gray Persian cat, to settle him in the kitchen for the night. Kitty was still in the garden, and Cook went to the balcony calling him. Suddenly, I saw a black cat flying in and disappearing behind or under a seat. First, I did not take much notice of this, but when, a minute after, Kitty slowly and solemnly stepped in, followed by Cook, it struck me that the dark something could not have been Kitty, and that Thanet and Iona made the remark simultaneously. Now we began to look for the dark one all over the place without any result. Cook had not seen any cat pass her on the balcony, but Kitty, the gray one. Thanet had a black Persian cat, which died before Kitty came. There is also 2 more stories to corroborate the same event. Killed by a streetcar, but walks in at the front door. Some 5 years ago, we had a little puppy about 6 months old. I used to train him to always go round the back way to come in the house. One day he got hurt and run over, being instantly killed by a streetcar. A day or 2 after the incident, I was going in my front door and saw the dog go up the steps in front of me, as plain as I ever saw him in my life. It seemed he knew that I had taught him he must not go in the front way, because he would go a few steps and then turn around and look at me, as though he wanted to see how I was taking it. And I positively saw him go the full length of the hall into the house, a distance of about 20 feet, before he disappeared. I saw him do this at least 3 times in 2 months that we stayed in that flat. I told at least a half dozen people of the incident at the time it happened, and I can vouch for its authenticity. I remain yours truly. Chaz A. Thompson, Chicago, Illinois. Mrs. Vincent Taylor's experience, a spirit purr. On the evening of February 1906, my son and I were quietly reading in full gaslight, our small gray cat lying on the sofa a short distance from where I sat. Suddenly I saw on my knee a large red and white cat, which belonged to us in India, which was a very dear family friend, and as fond of us as a child. On leaving India, we were obliged to give him to a friend, and in the end he shared the usual fate of pets in that country, making a meal for some wild animal. Roofy Oofy, in his spirit shape, purred vigorously, rubbing his head against me and giving every sign of delight at seeing us again. I did not speak, but in a few minutes my son looked up and said, "Mother, Roofy Oofy is on your knee," when the spirit cat jumped down and went to him to be petted. Then he returned to me and walked along the sofa to where our present cat, Kim, was asleep. spirit cat, with the look of an almost human fun, patted Kim's head, the latter awakening with a start. Roofy Oofy continued to make playful dabs at Kim's ears. Kim followed each movement with glaring eyes, distinctly seeing and realizing that another cat was invading his sofa, but not in the least angry with him, and quite ready to play. After a few minutes, the spirit cat came back to my knee, whereupon the earth cat displayed jealousy, which Roofy Oofy resented. But before they came to actual words, the spirit cat retired behind the veil. Arjuna. So quoth, this ring